put it bluntly, if you die and rise from the dead, I promise to listen very carefully to everything you have to say. Why? Because it's evidence you're reliable.
There's various other historical accounts throughout various religions of almost identical stories. For example, one of the Egyptian deities who was equivalent sort of to Jesus did the same process of dying, rising from the grave, etc. So that doesn't seem to select him as a special case.
I'm up here.
You're not. You're a delight.
Thank you. Because I know there are other people probably want to ask, but I mean, I'm not the person who I want to dictate my own life. I really do want to follow Jesus, but I did commit my life to him years ago, but I'm at this dilemma where I'm totally conflicted inside, and I'm just wondering if you think that me doubting means that I don't even believe in him anymore.
Okay, great question. Man, we all have doubts. I have doubts. Any thinking person has doubts. Why? Because you can't prove anything. Can I prove to you that I'm not a bad dream you're having right now? No, I can't. It's possible that I'm a bad dream you're having right now. That's possible.
It'd be a good dream.
Well, thank you. You're very gracious and kind. You see, you can't prove anything in life. Why? To prove means to show it cannot be another way. Well, I cannot prove to you it cannot be another way. All right, so therefore, the epistemological cynic says, fine, so we can't know anything. Rubbish. We can know things, but we can't prove them. Well, then what's knowledge based on? Knowledge is based on evidence. The evidence is you're not dreaming right now. The evidence is you and I are having a conversation. That's why I seek to respect you and answer whatever you ask. I don't just sort of start flying out into la-la land. No. I listen to you, I respond to you. I'm convinced we are in reality, not in a dream. So, I as a thinking human being base my life on evidence, which means, am I going to doubt? Of course I'm going to doubt. I can't prove anything, so I'm going to doubt almost everything. And I find that to be very healthy. Not only that, Jesus commands us to be skeptical. In Matthew chapter 7, verse 1, Jesus says, "Judge not, lest you be judged." 14 verses later, Matthew 7:15, Jesus says, "Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves, and they'll eat your lunch." So obviously, when Jesus says, "Judge not," he's not saying, suspend your critical thinking and blindly believe. No, he is not saying that. Because 14 verses later he says, you better use your analytical skills and you better analyze whether that person's out to rip you off or whether they really do love you and are a person of integrity. So you see, there's got to be skepticism in this life, according to Christ. Why? Because good and evil are so intertwined. It is scary. And all you got to do is look in your own heart and realize how good and evil are intertwined. And they are definitely intertwined in my heart. I am very grateful that there's not a TV screen behind my head which shows you in living color all of my motives, all of my fantasies. I would hate for you all to see that. That would be embarrassing. And yet at other times, yes, I can do that which is good. Well, guess what? All of us are just like that.
So you're saying that because the historical Jesus appears to be a reliable figure, you can extrapolate from that his teachings are true, and does include that he is who he says he is?
Because the historical evidence is that he's trustworthy, you are very wise to trust in him and then to have your own experience with him. Let me give you an example. I've had a couple of overwhelming experiences of Christ in my life. But I've got a brother who's 2 years younger than me, who at one point in his life said, Cliff, I'm a follower of Christ, but it's not because of any experience. It's just because I use my mind and the evidence is Christ is reliable. This younger brother is a transplant surgeon over at Duke University Hospital. He transplants kidneys and livers. So he's far more intelligent than I'm ever going to be, that's for sure. And so his faith at one point was simply based on, here's the evidence, based on the evidence, I'm going to trust. I've looked at the options. The evidence is that Christ is more reliable than any of the other options, be it science, mathematics, to build your life on mathematics. I mean, what does that look like? Build your life on science? What does that look like? Build your life on pleasure-seeking, physical sensations? What does that look like? It looks pretty empty. And so he said, I'm going to put my faith in Christ. Then in 1997, his 7-year-old daughter was killed suddenly in a horrible car accident. And his faith was really shaken. He doubted. He struggled with pain, incredible pain, over the death of his little daughter. 2 years after that, when he was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, was where he was working at that time, transplanting kidneys and livers, suddenly he's seated in his office. And he calls me up and he says, Cliff, I don't know whether it was just a dream I had or whether it was a vision. But my little daughter came and sat on my lap. And I had a conversation with her. I don't know if this was a dream or a vision. And after a while, she got up off my lap and she began to walk away. And I said, Annie, where are you going? And she said, don't worry about me, Daddy. I'm going to be with Jesus. Now, I can promise you, sir, for me to hear that from my younger brother, who's a transplant surgeon, who never had an experience of Christ in his life, who was very cerebral, he's brilliant, and he puts his faith in Christ because the evidence is Jesus is the truth. To talk about that experience was amazing. But once again, I'm not going to put my faith in Christ because my younger brother, who's a brilliant guy, has this experience, whether it be a dream or a vision, of Christ. But that's how Christ met him in his own unique situation, in his pain over the loss of his little girl. So I don't know how Christ is going to meet you. I don't know. But I do know that it would be wise for you to put your faith in him because the evidence is he's trustworthy. See, if a guy dies and comes back from the dead, you got to take him seriously, don't you?
I feel as though were the Christian God real, he's allowing a massive amount of suffering and horrible things to happen all across the world. So I don't see how, if he is truly a benevolent force, if he does exist, he can allow widespread suffering through entirely innocent children dying of bone cancer, etc., to persist on such a scale.
All right. Now we're getting down to brass tacks for me. You're right. Real problem. God is supposedly all-powerful, he's supposedly loving, and now you got babies dying. You got little kids dying of weird diseases. Where is God? Is he asleep on the switch? What's happening? And I can promise you, sir, when my niece died in that car wreck, my brother was asking the same question. I mean, come on, God. The babysitter couldn't see the stop sign because it was covered by some leaves. He runs through the stop sign, pickup truck at 55 miles an hour is coming down, smacks my niece into oblivion. Come on, God. What about moving the branch so the babysitter could see the stop sign and stop and not go barreling through the stop sign and have the pickup truck hit him at 55 miles an hour? You're right. Big question. I do not know why God allowed evil and suffering. But I do know that although you have a problem and I have a problem right now, we'd have a bigger problem if atheism is true. Because if atheism is true, if secularism is true, then it doesn't matter that those kids get cancer and die. What is. Survival of the fittest. That's natural and real. Your moral outrage over the death of a little child is a tremendous piece of evidence that God exists, because you know that the death of that little child is not good. Something is really wrong.
So that's coming back to the absolute morality and all that. How do psychopaths tie into that? Because they don't have that sort of sense of absolute morality. They don't believe there is a right and wrong beyond their own thing.
Sir, thank you for the seriousness of your question and thinking. I really appreciate it. You're right. Next logical question. What about the psychopath? All right. Well, I think we know what the issue is with a psychopath. The only sickness is not cancer or clogged arteries. There is chemical imbalance in the brain that leads to mental sickness. The mind falls apart, and you've got a psychopath who is seriously sick in the brain, has no conscience, very little ability to think rationally, and does something as wicked and warped as starts wiping people out and murdering them. Yeah. It's an excellent example of how messed up this world is. But once again, if there is no God, and if science is our ultimate object of faith, then what is. It's matter and energy. And so the psychopath has some type of balance of, or imbalance, as you might call it, of matter and energy. So what? What is. As soon as you start making value judgments, you've left science and you've jumped into philosophy, and really you've jumped into religion. Is there a God who defines right and wrong, who defines what's natural and what's unnatural? Or is there no God? And if there is no God, let's face it, what is. I go up and smack her in the face, nothing wrong with that. That's my choice. What is. I go up and give her $10 for lunch, nothing good about that, it just is. That's reality if there is no God. It's all matter and energy, and you don't have values of this is good, this is kind, this is compassionate, versus this is hateful, racist, evil, mean. Does that make any sense?
Sort of, but I believe that, again, the morality stems from the human impact of that action. So smacking her in the face would be wrong because it is causing a negative impact on her, whereas giving her $10 would be positive action because it is helping her. Whereas if there is a God and he is allowing all of these things to exist, that would make him evil because he is causing a hugely negative human impact to happen.
Okay. The all-powerful God chose to partially limit his power by giving us free will.
But that doesn't explain children dying of things that are entirely not a result of human action.
That's right. Instead, children dying of inane diseases is an example of the breakdown of the good creation. But you see, your outrage over the death of those innocent children is a clear sign that indeed there is a real good versus a real evil. It's a sign that God, some type of God, has to exist. Because if there is no God, what are you getting so outraged over the death of a little child? I mean, little baby bunnies die all the time. We step on insects all the time, and they die. And so a little baby dies. So what? What is. When you start introducing values, oh, no, this little baby child has value, and therefore that baby's death is really wrong, all of a sudden you are out of science, guys. You are into religion, into values, which you cannot scientifically prove. I mean, just think about it. Can you scientifically prove that this guy is worth less or worthwhile? You can't scientifically prove that this gentleman is worth less or he's worthwhile. That is a value judgment that you're making. All right, so the question is, are values real? Is there a basis for an objective value? Or are values totally relative? Culture. Well, in my culture, he's valuable. But in this other culture, he's not valuable. And it's all relative. And that's what so many of your professors are into, aren't they? How dare you go from your culture to his culture and make a value judgment? You're an arrogant twit. You have no right to make those kind of value judgments on another culture. Classic example is the Nuremberg trials, 1946 to 1949. The height of them were 24 Nazi officers are being judged. They hired a brilliant lawyer. This Nazi lawyer stands up at the Nuremberg trials and says, time out. Who do you allies think you are, coming from the United States, England, and France, to judge our culture, Germany, Nazi Germany? All these people did was live out what their culture taught them was good. And the Nuremberg trials shut down until Robert Jackson, the American consul, stood up and said, there is a law above the law of culture. And according to that law, it is wrong to gas Jews in Dachau and Auschwitz and Buchenwald. And these men are evil. And the Nuremberg trials kicked back in. Why? It's all based on there is a law above culture. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I agree that there is objective morality. I just don't think that it stems from religion.
You can't have it. If there is no God, what's the basis of What's the basis of objective morality?
So the purpose of life is to reproduce in the purely scientific viewpoint, right?
No.
No.
Science can't tell you the purpose of life. Science can simply tell you what is. This is. If you think science gets into purpose, you're mixing philosophy and science. Science has nothing to say about purpose, value, good and evil. Science has everything to do with objectively analyzing what happens materially, physically. That's science.
Okay, and objectively, creatures' primary urge is to reproduce, to persist their genetic code, to keep that moving.
And there's therefore survival of the fittest, and there is the good die young, and there is babies get cancer and pass, and there's nothing wrong with that. They just had a genetic fallacy, abnormality, so it just is.
I disagree with that, though, because slapping her in the face would be a negative action. It's decreasing the likelihood. Like, killing people would be narrowing the gene pool. It's a negative thing. It's not allowing them to continue. So to take that away.
Right. Yeah. And that's why the student at Duke University stepped out of the crowd and said, Cliffe, I'll tell you why Mother Teresa works among the dying in Calcutta, India. It's to preserve the genetic pool. What a stinking joke. Mother Teresa did not work among the dying in Calcutta, India in order to preserve the genetic pool. Mother Teresa worked among the dying in Calcutta, India because she understood the value of a human life. She understood the reality of compassion and justice.
I agree. I just think that our perception of the reality of those things stems from our want to continue, our recognition that other people are as we are, and we have this sort of drive to allow them to persist because of the way we've been created scientifically. If that makes sense.
Well, we weren't created, right? We weren't created scientifically. I mean, if there is no God, we weren't created. We just happened.
Yeah.
Right? It's a cosmic chance. Right. And you really can believe that we just happened by chance.
Yeah.
Why is that reasonable to you?
Because I believe that's where the evidence points rather than. I just take issue with. I think that I'm agnostic. I think that there can be a God, and I think that the evidence could potentially point that direction. I just don't think that the current ideologies that I've heard about and have read about are correct.
Okay, now I loved your first statement. You said, because I think the evidence is that it just happened by chance. What's that evidence?
Okay, I may have misspoke there. I mean that I don't think the evidence points towards any current God.
Fine. So what does the evidence point to? And what is that evidence?
Points towards anything.
Pardon?
I don't think the evidence points towards anything. I don't think it's conclusive.
You don't think there's evidence that you don't get order and design by chance? Instead, you get order and design because a designer, an intelligent mind, brings the order there? You don't see that around you?
I think that it's possible that this could have all come into existence by chance and really happened in infinite universes. It should have happened eventually. So I don't think that the existence necessitates a creator.
Okay, good. I agree with you. Anything is possible. But the question for a thinking human being is, what does the evidence point to? Where is the evidence that you get order and design by chance? Everything in my life, everything in my experience tells me you get order and design, be it a shirt, be it a wristwatch, be it a camera, because of an intelligent mind designing it. Now, this eye puts that camera to shame in complexity. If I think you're irrational to believe that camera came about by chance, then why isn't it appropriate for me to think it's irrational to say that this eye came about by chance?
I understand your argument. I just don't agree with it.
Okay, good. So why don't you agree with it?
I don't think that, again, I think it could point towards a greater being. I don't think it necessarily does. I just don't think that it points towards the Christian God or any other, as humans have interpreted them.
I agree with you. Order and design do not point to Jesus Christ. No way. But order and design clearly point to some type of mind behind it all. Wouldn't you say?
Maybe.
Well, I guess it's just because I'm not as intelligent as you or as talented as you. Because you see, my experience of life is I got to work really, really hard to speak in an articulate way, to think in a rational, logical way. It just doesn't happen by accident. I got to work really hard. And I wanted to play major college basketball, so I went to Davidson College down in North Carolina. Yeah, alma mater of Steph Curry. And I tried to play ball there. I barely made the team. And when the team went out to play UCLA, the coach on the last home game before they made the trip comes up to me and says, "Cliff, I'm sorry, there's not a seat on the airplane for you. We're leaving you behind." You see, so whenever anybody says to me, "Oh yeah, man, order and design, like putting a ball through a hoop 10 feet off the ground, just comes about by chance." That so contradicts everything in my experience. Because I got to work really, really hard to get a good GPA in college, when I was in college, to put a ball through a hoop. It just doesn't happen. And I can promise you, when you get into relationships, they just don't happen. You get into a marriage and trying to raise a family, it just doesn't happen by accident, guys. It falls apart really quickly unless you have an intent to love, to respect, to forgive, to be patient, to bear with people who are really different from you. It just doesn't happen by accident, guys.
Making the case earlier that the only way for moral absolutes to exist is through religion, I think that moral absolutes can exist simply through allowing other people the freedom to have choices. For example, killing would be wrong because it's stealing the freedom to do anything else in their life. Stealing is wrong because it's taking that away from them, etc.
Okay. The reason that you cannot have an objective moral if there is no mind prior to the human mind is because it takes a mind to define right and wrong. So if there is no mind prior to the human mind, it's obviously the human mind that defines right and wrong. So your human mind has one definition, my human mind has another definition, the white South African, the KKK, their minds have another definition. Mother Teresa had one definition, Adolf Hitler had another definition, Gandhi had one definition, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton have another definition. You see, it's all relative then. But if there is a mind prior to the human mind who created us and gave us value, then it's possible that to steal your backpack is absolutely wrong because it's a violation of the value that God gave you. But if there is no God who gives you value, you're just a bag of chemicals. That's all I am. Does that make any sense?
So through that, does the morality of this God not change in your belief from the Old Testament to the New Testament, as Jesus' teachings differ hugely from those of the Old Testament God?
Great question. Very hard question. At first glance, it seems that you're right. At first glance, when you read many of the laws in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and then you compare them to the Sermon on the Mount, you got a problem here. What's going on? There are some definite differences, contradictions. Now, what you've got to do is you've got to go back and study the context of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. What you will find is those are laws, civil laws, for a nation of Israel, which is a theocracy. And God is giving civil laws for a nation which is qualitatively different from personal laws in personal morality. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is not saying, this is to be the law of the United States. This is to be the law of Russia, England, France. No, he is talking about personal morality, whereas the laws that you have in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are given by God through Moses for a theocracy. So they're civil laws.
So then why would the civil laws differ from the moral laws of person? If you don't want every person to be moral, why would you have civil laws that seem to violate those teachings?
Great question. Please, as soon as you're able to, read Matthew chapter 19. Some religious teachers come up to Jesus and say, hey, Jesus, is it permissible to divorce your wife? For men to divorce their wives? And Jesus says, no, was not God's intent when he originally created in Genesis 1 and 2. And they say, well, then fine. Why in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy does Moses say, hey, men, write a certificate of divorce, give it to the woman, and kick her out? And Jesus responds, this is not the way it was to be from the beginning. But God allowed this due to the hardening of your hearts. So a lot of that law in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy is God responding to hard hearts. So is it possible that although God created marriage to be a lifelong commitment till death parts us, is it possible that a man could whoop up so badly on a woman and a woman could whoop up so badly on a man that divorce would be permissible? Yes, but that is not God's original intent in creating marriage. Is it possible that human beings could sink so low that they would enslave each other? Yes. And so what God is doing with the Jewish nation is he's beginning to teach them why slavery is wrong, how they are to treat their slaves, and he's moving them eventually out of slavery. But right bam, there's a law regarding how you're going to treat your slaves. Now, that is not good. But it is due to the hardness of the human heart that those laws are given to a nation of Israel, that calling them to be different from all the nations around them. Does that make any sense?
So your argument that the law of allowing a man to beat a slave as long as he doesn't kill them within 2 days is justified because it's better than what was previously existing?
It's not justified, but it is an example of how God tightens the noose on evil and immorality, saying, stop it, stop it, stop it more, but he doesn't jump them to the next stage that is so contrary to all the culture, all of the environment, so he doesn't do that.
Okay, so your claim is that the Old Testament is sort of an easing of the human race to allow them to get to a point of better morality from what was previously existing?
I'm arguing that there's such a thing as progressive revelation, where God reveals more and more truth to a very hardened person. For instance, I've been a Christian for years, but I'm embarrassed to tell you the truth over some of the horrible things I still do. Some of my motives, good gracious, they're so selfish and greedy, it's incredible. And I'm real glad nobody here sees them, right? So yes, I've been a follower of Christ for over 45 years, and yet I still struggle with evil, and God is still patient with me. And no, I'm not a flaming hypocrite. I got some seriously bad habits.
One other question. I heard you address the existence of a God. You may have addressed this earlier, but what is your claim for the existence of the Christian God versus some other unnamed deity?
Great question. You're right. Earlier, I talked about the evidence for the existence of God. Right now, you're asking the next logical question, which is fine. So there's some type of God, some type of intelligent mind who creates the order and design. But who is this God? What is this God like? I mean, I doubt you've had a coffee with God, Cliff. You're right. I never have had coffee with God. So how am I going to know God? I can't see him. I can't audibly hear him. Well, here's the parallel. How am I going to know you? I'm only going to know you if you choose to open up and reveal to me who you are, what you like, what you dislike. If you lie to me, or if you remain silent, I'm never going to have the privilege of getting to know you. There will never be a relationship. A relationship demands people opening up and revealing who they are to another person. Same with God. God has to open up. Otherwise, I'm not going to know God. That's where Jesus Christ, Muhammad, the avatars of Hinduism, step into the picture. They all claim to be revealing God accurately. The problem is they contradict each other. So they're either all wrong or one of them's right. But they can't all be right because they contradict each other. So why would I trust Jesus Christ to tell me the truth about God? Because the historical evidence of his ethical teachings, like the Sermon on the Mount, the way he treated people, the way he died, loving and forgiving his enemies, not cursing his enemies the way I would have, but most importantly, sir, the way 3 days after he dies, he rises from the dead. That combination of teaching, lifestyle, the way he died, the way he rose from the dead, those 4 points convince me that he is reliable. To put it bluntly, if you die and rise from the dead, I promise to listen very carefully to everything you have to say. Why? Because it's evidence you're reliable.
There's various other historical accounts throughout various religions of almost identical stories. For example, one of the Egyptian deities who was equivalent sort of to Jesus did the same process of dying, rising from the grave, etc. So that doesn't seem to select him as a special case.
Okay, so study that example. It's Osiris, right? So Osiris dies. His body is cut up into 14 different pieces. And what happens is, his sister comes, finds 13 of the 14 pieces, puts them back together, and then he lives a shadowy existence in the underworld. First point, that's written in the literary style, not a historical narrative, but a mythology. Second point, it's not a physical bodily resurrection. It's the sister putting 13 of the 14 parts back together again, and then Osiris lives in a shadowy underworld. All of that is in clear contradiction to the Gospels, which insist Jesus died, he was buried, 3 days later he rose from the dead, and he walks up to Thomas and says, right here, my man, take your hands and put them the nail prints in my hands, take your hand and thrust it in the spear wound in my side, and Thomas stopped doubting and believed. That's not written in the literary style of mythology, that's written in the literary style of historical narrative. And what it's claiming is a physical bodily resurrection, not a spiritual resurrection, a physical resurrection, which he convinces Thomas of by saying right here, grab hold of me, see the nail prints.
I'm also sure you get this question all the time, but that corresponds to like 2,000 years ago. What is your evidence for God's existence to this day in his interactions with the modern world?
Okay, talk a little bit more. I'm not quite sure I understand exactly.
So, assuming that Jesus did come back, that supports the case that God was active 2,000 years ago. What's the case that he still is present and acting in the modern world?
The evidence that Christ is active and at work in the modern world is the way Christ is changing lives today. So I get to work in prisons, I get to work in nursing homes, I get to speak on university campuses, I pastor a church, I get to be with families in emergency rooms, parents losing children. So, you know, I'm privileged as a pastor to be able to get close to people in some pretty horrendous situations. And to watch the power of Jesus Christ to bring hope, to bring security, to bring peace, to bring joy into some pretty horrendous situations, I celebrate.
But is that not sort of the effect that you are having through your belief versus an actual manifestation of a God?
Okay, good question. Now, remember that line of thinking you can use on everything, right? You can always sit back and say, well, I'm going to psychologically analyze you, and really what's going on is just a psychological trick, all right? So that is why I'm not standing out here saying, please believe in Jesus because I have a relationship with Jesus. You'd be a fool to believe in Jesus because I got a relationship with Jesus, because for all you know, what I call my relationship with Jesus is indigestion I'm having over breakfast, right? That's why I'm standing here saying, don't take it from me. Instead, read the Gospels for yourself, the source documents. But then you went on and asked me, okay, but what about today? And obviously Jesus is not walking around on the planet right now. Obviously he says it's his Spirit who's at work within us. And what I'm trying to relate to you, sir, is, yes, the results of God's Spirit, the Spirit of Christ, working in people's lives to change their lives, to bring hope out of despair, to bring forgiveness where there is guilt, is a powerful piece of evidence that indeed he's true.
I sort of think that his legacy would have the same effect and that that's more of what we're seeing in the modern world, as it doesn't seem that there's a active, powerful force actually doing things to change the situation. Rather, it's the way that people respond to their belief that there is that greater power.
Okay, great. Now, Stuart, why don't you come up? Stuart's spent more time than I have in psychology, and you're asking a great question. So, Stuart, why don't you take it away?
So I was just with a group of people who were New Agers, right? And so the New Age movement gets at, we can all tap into God. In a way, we all are God. There's the light in you, the light in me, and we are one. One thing that really moved them to the point of accepting Jesus Christ and an understanding of the Christian belief and faith is, okay, we also have at our core in society today, everybody does, a sense of guilt and shame. And where do we get this from? Whether it's our own emotional makeups, whether it's comparing ourselves to others, whether it's how our parents treated us growing up, the list goes on and on. And so these people who were New Agers and now they're Christians, I asked them, well, why'd you become Christians? Well, why would you do that? The New Age movement has plenty of great resources. And they said, because of the gospel's understanding of grace. We felt guilt and shame at times for what we did in the past. Most of them alluded to relationships, how they treated people. And the gospel basically came in, they experienced grace, and they felt joy, love, and happiness unlike they ever have, and they claim they ever will. So that's one piece, yeah.
I don't understand how you're saying that changes from what I was saying earlier.
Maybe I missed the question. What exactly is the question?
I'm saying that all of the evidence that I've heard for the current existence for God stems from people's reaction to the concept that he does exist. So their feeling of forgiveness and coming to terms and accepting their actions of the past would be the same whether or not there was actually a God, as long as they exist, or as long as they believe that he did exist or does exist. And through believing that he exists, they are, through their belief in his forgiveness of them, coming to forgive themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, so they would totally disagree with you on coming to forgive themselves, right? They're buying into, back to your piece on morality, they say that there's absolutely a transcendent level to this universe. We're not just materialistic, naturalistic human beings. And so they would say it's not simply through an ethical teaching or somehow just simply connection with a type of doctrine where you could say, oh, I believe this, and so I'll have this type of experience, and that'll get me some type of emotional high. No, they're saying that a relationship with Jesus Christ in particular gives this kind of freedom when it comes to another issue that many people say is identity. It's a matter of, okay, if Christ is alive and living today in heaven as well as in my own heart, which his claim is, then I have a freedom when it comes to my identity. No longer do I have to compare myself to others, right? No longer does someone else have to write the script for my life. And that is always, we're in denial if we don't think that's happening, right? A counselor might tell you, oh, set your own standard. You're struggling with anxiety or depression, just set your own standard. Live for yourself. Okay, that's never going to happen. We're always, in our subconscious, going to be living in one way or another for the applause of another person, right? Whether it's a wife, whether it's a parent, whether it's a professor, whatever it is, it's going to be the applause of other people in some kind of way. And so that gets at the freedom piece of it. Is that partly answering your question?
I don't think so. I'm not sure.
Keep going then. Ask it a different way.
So you were saying that, what were you saying? Just things.
I'm just giving pieces, glimpses from personal experience as well as the experiences of others who I counsel and pastor who've talked about how Christ is living and active today and how that's changing their lives. Is that kind of your question?
Sort of.
Yeah.
My question is, how would that differ from simply their belief that he is changing their lives in the same way?
Mm-hmm. So how do we know for sure that it's him doing it and not just a psychological trip by themselves.
Precisely.
Yeah. So I would say mainly through prayer, right? They believe through meditation and prayer and reading of the scripture that there is a spiritual encounter. And so another one is, you look at divorce rates today. Divorce rates today, you have well over 50% of marriages end in divorce. You add prayer, and that number drops down as low as some people say to 1% if couples pray together on a nightly basis. I don't know if I would go as low as 1%, but that's a pretty amazing statistic. And so these people are claiming it's not just a psychological, emotional trip that I have with myself. No, it's how did Jesus reveal himself in the scriptures? And clearly he says he's living and active in our hearts today, and that's what they believe.
Okay, so...
Wait. I like you. Because you are expressing very clearly why I conduct myself out here the way I do. You know, sometimes people get upset with me for being too rational or too cut and dry. But you see, your question is excellent because you're right. How do you know that Jesus Christ is not an emotional trip that you're convincing yourself is true? And you see, the way I conduct myself out here is I'm asking people to go back to the source documents, the Gospels, and to examine the historical Jesus of Nazareth in order to ask themselves, does the evidence point to him being reliable or not? I am not saying the reason that you should trust Jesus is because I've had an experience. Because you're absolutely right, sir. How do you know that your experience, Cliff, is not just chemical imbalances in your brain? It could be. How do you know you're just not making this stuff up and then convincing yourself of it? It could be. It's a very good point you're making, sir. And that is why I'm not standing here saying the reason everybody here should believe in Jesus is because I've had this incredible spiritual experience with Christ, and I really hope you too will have that experience. False. Somebody could just be paying me to stand out here and speak for all you know, right? Instead, faith in Christ is based not on someone's experience. Faith in Christ is based on the historical Jesus who lived, taught, died, rose from the dead. Examine the evidence for yourself by reading the New Testament Gospels. And what you'll find out is that there are some real differences between Jesus and Muhammad. When you have to accept Muhammad as reliable, you just have to accept it. You don't just accept Jesus because you have to accept it. Instead, you accept Jesus because the evidence of his lifestyle, teachings, death, and resurrection point to his credibility. If you're a hedonist, you live for pleasure. Why? Because that's what turns you on. It's what makes you feel good. And so you've decided that's what I'm going to do. It's party, party, party. It's stimulate my nerve endings. If you're a materialist, you've made a decision. More money, expensive toys. That's what it's all about. See, so I'm not saying accept Jesus because of some experience I or somebody else have had. I'm saying look at the evidence